let me just read you a few titles from his recent articles, and you can find some of these. Here's two pieces of national interest. A true solution to the Ukraine tragedy. That's from March 21st. Another one is America's Ukraine policy is all about Russia. Check that one out. Here are some titles of scholarly articles that are recent. Ukraine's ongoing struggle with its Russian identity, or why Russia and Ukraine need each other. And then Russian-Ukrainian church turmoil. Another one that was published in Harvard's Russia Matters. And then he also has an article called The Tragedy of Ukraine. In fact, that is the title of his new book, which I think you have some information about. But this book has come out just in 2022. The title, the full title being Tragedy of Ukraine, What Classical Greek Tragedy Can Teach Us About Conflict Resolution. So please join me in welcoming Nicolai.
Thank you, Lai. I was just thinking about how long it's been since I've been to the far north of our state. I'm a true Rhode Islander now. Well, I want to leave as much time as possible for your questions. So let me get straight to my presentation, which will be the first time I'm presenting more or less the themes of the conclusion of my book. With so much attention focused on the horrific pictures of violence in Ukraine, I thought I might say a few words about what happens after. Despite the fact that Russia's invasion has thrust the geopolitical conflict over Ukraine into the limelight, I am convinced that it is the domestic conflict there which is the real key to bringing the current cycle of tragedy to an end. To understand why, we need to see the present tragedy not as one, but three interrelated conflicts. The first conflict is the result of America's long-standing efforts to detach Ukraine from Russia's sphere of influence. The roots of this geopolitical tug of war go back to Zbigniew Brzezinski's thesis that Ukrainian independence can serve as a geopolitical pivot for transforming Russia. Since it was first articulated in 1997, it has become a cornerstone of US foreign policy. As the longtime president of the National Endowment for Democracy, Carl Gershom, put it on the eve of the 2014 Maidan, Ukraine is, quote, the biggest prize. If it could be pulled away from Russia, then Putin may find himself on the losing end, not just in the near abroad, but within Russia itself. The second conflict stems from the clashes between Russian and Ukrainian elites over the nature and limits of Ukrainian sovereignty. In Russia, hostility to Ukrainian sovereignty is driven by fear that the far right, which has grown in influence since 2014, will someday transform Ukraine from a friendly neighbor into anti-Russia. In Ukraine, by contrast, hostility toward Russia is fueled by fear that the failure to draw a sharp distinction between the two nations will prevent the emergence of a Ukrainian national identity. As former Ukrainian President Viktor Yushchenko said last year, quote, if Russians and Ukrainians are one people, then Ukrainian people don't exist, end quote. These mutual fears have prevented any mutual dialogue. But the most important conflict, to my mind, remains the conflict within Ukraine between its historically Russophile East, Malorussia, and its historically Russophobe West, Galicia, Galiciana, but Galicia in English. This conflict has been going on for at least 150 years and has erupted in serious military hostilities inside Ukraine at least 3 times during the First and Second World Wars and after the 2014 Maidan. It should be noted that in each instance, this violence was exacerbated by the intervention of foreign powers seeking to tip the scales within Ukraine to their own advantage. Resolving this internecine conflict over who gets to define Ukrainian identity would remove the main irritant that foreign actors have used to stoke the other two conflicts. This, however, would require a new level of dialogue, compassion, and mutual reconciliation among Ukrainians themselves. Any hope of such a reconciliation in this generation has been dashed by Russia's 2022 invasion, which has reignited the civil war in Donbass and thus renewed the cycle of tragedy. In a selfish and narrow-minded pursuit of her own national interests, Russia has sought to impose neutrality and federalism on Ukraine, hoping thereby to reverse its disadvantages, Russia's disadvantages, in all three conflicts that I mentioned before simultaneously. In the strategic conflict with America, by forcing the United States to take heed of Russia's red lines, in the bilateral conflict with Ukraine, by bringing NATO's military plans for the country to an end, and in the domestic conflict, by restoring the balance of interest between Eastern and Western Ukraine to what they were before 2014. Some analysts predict that the domestic conflict will now be a thing of the past, that the crucible of war with Russia is forging a united Ukrainian nation. This is not a new argument. Indeed, it has been the Ukrainian government's position since 2014. According, again, to former Ukrainian President Yushchenko, the current conflict is but the latest of 25 wars that Russia has waged against Ukraine. And yet, when asked last year what they thought of President Putin's statement that Ukrainians and Russians are one people, 41% of Ukrainians overall and nearly 2/3 in Eastern and Southern Ukraine said that they agreed with him. The fact that hostility toward Russia is currently at an all-time high in Ukraine is therefore no guarantee that it can be sustained for years and decades to come. Perhaps, as a result of this war, there will be a permanent shift in the mentality of Malaros Ukrainians. But if the past 8 years are any indication, then a fundamental values reorientation of Russophile Ukrainians away from Russia still seems to me unlikely. It is worth noting that while positive attitudes toward Putin and the Russian government over these last 8 years have fallen sharply, personal sympathies of Ukrainians for average Russians, much less so. And even though the Russian language has been effectively forced out of the public sphere in Ukraine, it remains the language of choice in schools, publishing, entertainment, and internet usage in every region of the country, but the 3 regions of historical Galicia. As pro-Maidan journalist Vitaly Portnikov put it earlier this year, quote, "As long as Ukrainians and Russians cry over the same television shows, the president of Ukraine is definitely Vladimir Putin, not Vladimir Zelensky, at least for a very large portion of Ukrainians," end quote. Another conundrum that Western analysts would prefer not to delve into too much is what to do with the people in Donbass and Crimea, most of whom no longer wish to be part of Ukraine. This is corroborated by numerous publicly available polls, as well as internal polling done by the Ukrainian government, which has been leaked to the Ukrainian press. Given these mutually exclusive claims, the nightmare scenario that Ukraine faces is that the front line of the new Cold War between Russia and the West will cut directly across Ukraine, prolonging the domestic conflict there indefinitely. At the outset of the conflict in 2014, I described this situation as akin to the dilemma faced by King Solomon in the Bible, only instead of being like the woman who relinquished her claims to save the life of a disputed child, Russia and the West are both acting like the woman who would rather see that child torn asunder than let the other have it. How can we avoid this nightmare scenario from happening, particularly now that the sides are engaged in a full-blown military conflict? By making Ukraine less dependent on external actors, and thereby removing it as a source of contention between them. This means restoring agency to the Ukrainian people, as well as restoring Ukrainian state sovereignty. The most important requirement for restoring agency is to establish harmony between Galicia and Malaros Ukraine. This will require grassroots initiatives and government policies that recognize Malaros culture as a legitimate part of Ukraine's indigenous diversity. The trade-off, which was actually quite effective in preserving unity before 2004, is this: cultural autonomy for political loyalty. Given the propensity of Ukrainian politicians to exploit regional differences for their own personal gain, it would be wise if such an informal arrangement, which Ukraine's first president, Leonid Kravchuk, actually made in his 1991 appeal to Russian co-citizens on the eve of the referendum on Ukrainian independence, it would be wise if this informal arrangement were codified this time around. As for restoring sovereignty, while there are many ways to resolve the interstate conflict between Russia, Ukraine, and the West, most are at the expense of Ukrainian sovereignty. The only approach that would actually strengthen Ukraine's independence from foreign influence would be for Malaros Ukraine and Galician Ukraine to agree to a process of national reconciliation. This would discourage the regional partisanships that have plagued Ukrainian politics for generations, and that external actors have been all too eager to manipulate for their own ends. Forging a common vision of the future, however, would require a repudiation of integral nationalism, the very ideology at the heart of Ukraine's post-Maidan political life, and an embrace instead of a patriotism that defines Ukraine as primarily a civic rather than an ethno-national community. Although the terms nationalism and patriotism are often used interchangeably, in fact, they have very different historical origins and meanings. Whereas nationalism seeks social unity through exclusion, relying on criteria that are inherited, such as language, religion, and ethnicity, patriotism strives for social unity through inclusion and is based on criteria that can be chosen, such as citizenship. The former typically leads to an ethnic polity, the latter to a civic polity. Ukrainian nationalists would therefore have to move beyond their 1930s view that security demands total cultural homogeneity, while Russophile Ukrainians would have to prioritize their allegiance to the Ukrainian state. Both tasks rely on empathy to allay the fears of the other side so that true dialogue between them can begin. Such a dialogue aimed at forging a shared and non-exclusive civic concept of Ukrainian identity could be set up through a Ukrainian Truth and Reconciliation Commission. By giving voice to the grievances of those who fought on either side of this conflict, the TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission process, could become the modern-day equivalent of the Dionysian festivals of ancient Greece, offering riveting emotional testimony, highly choreographed and dramatized public spectacles leading to public catharsis, a purging of the soul that restores healthy perspective by removing hatreds. In over 47 countries, such commissions have become powerful tools for social healing by restoring humanity to the once enemy other. An essential component of virtually all Truth and Reconciliation Commissions is the propagation of liberal values and human rights. It is striking that despite a 19th century liberal tradition that includes such illustrious names as Mikhail Dragomanov, Maxim Kovalevsky, Bakhtan Kistyakovsky, Mikhailo Turan-Baranovsky, Mykola Vasilenko, and Vladimir Vernadsky, Ukrainian liberalism has been totally eclipsed by Ukrainian nationalism, which sees not enough that is distinctively Ukrainian about it. This is, of course, entirely correct. The liberal intellectual tradition of the 19th century was a shared heritage by both Ukrainians and Russians alike, which is precisely why it would be so valuable for establishing an inclusive and thoroughly patriotic civic consensus today. The experience of Truth and Reconciliation Commissions around the world suggests that the best way to popularize liberal ideals is not to mimic Western models of thought and governance, but rather to make people aware of their own liberal tradition, explaining why it developed in the first place and how it might respond to the current challenges that Ukrainian society faces. Key among these are promoting the rule of law and forging new and better ties with both Russia and Europe on the basis of shared values. Of course, not all aspects of the Truth and Reconciliation process are appropriate for all situations. What worked in Spain, for example, might not work in Ukraine. Nevertheless, all successful models seem to have one thing in common. They begin with an interim, often imperfect peace settlement. This lull in hostilities creates an opportunity for cooler heads to emerge who, over time, forge longer-term solutions. Forgiveness and compassion require a calm social space where hatred can give way to true dialogue and the healing of society begin. As Archbishop Desmond Tutu, chairman of South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Committee, put it, when it is implemented systematically, forgiveness becomes, quote, thoroughly political. It is realpolitik, end quote. What are the prospects for such healing taking place today? Admittedly, very slim. given the fervor aroused by Russia's invasion and the influence that Ukrainian nationalists have in the media, education, entertainment, religion, and cultural policies, what incentives would they have to share power? Not much, I grant you, unless they believe that the nation's very survival is at stake. During the First World War, for example, Simeon Petlura agreed to cede all of Western Ukraine to Poland in exchange for Polish support against the Red Army. This betrayal triggered the denunciation of the Akt Zluky, Ukraine's first declaration of independence, and the de facto disintegration of Ukraine. Nevertheless, Petlura is today honored as a national hero. Near the end of the Second World War, in order to better cast their alliance with Nazi Germany as a struggle for Ukrainian independence, the leaders of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists rewrote their charter and eliminated its most racially offensive and undemocratic portions. Likewise, in 1991, when it seemed that some regions of the country might not vote for independence, the leader of Ruch, Vyacheslav Chernovil, embraced what he called German-style federalism as the best option for Ukraine. Even more recently, when faced with military collapse, President Poroshenko agreed to autonomy for parts of Donbass in the Minsk Accords, even though, as his foreign minister, Pavlo Klimkin, now admits, this was just a ruse to gain time for the military to recuperate. Could we be looking at a similar situation in 2022? One could argue that all that these examples prove is that nationalists cannot be trusted to compromise, that their apparent willingness to do so is purely tactical. That is a valid point, but it is also conceivable that confronted with the fact that their policies have failed and led to the de facto partition of Ukraine, some nationalists might revisit their assumption that cultural, religious, and linguistic monism is the only path to political unity. It might be possible to persuade moderate nationalists, those not fanatically committed to a totalitarian form of nationalism, but by accepting political loyalty in exchange for cultural diversity, they would actually be achieving their summum bonum, the restoration of political agency and sovereignty to Ukraine, by taking the agenda out of the hands of foreign powers and putting it in the hands of Ukrainians themselves. In sum, while I see no nationalistic solution for Ukraine's domestic divisions, and I include war in that, I do see a path whereby patriotism could bring Ukrainians together into a civic rather than an ethnic community. To get there, however, Ukrainians will have to overcome their fear of their own diversity and call upon their entire history and culture, both Galician and Malaros. For, as sociologist Vladimir Ishchenko has put it, only a pluralistic Ukraine can become a sovereign bridge between Europe and Russia. Thank you.
So much. Like it's so refreshing to hear kind of a.
It actually wound up being optimistic, didn't it? So missing. Missing.
Yeah. Stinger. All right, the floor is open. think of some questions here. We have a lot on the table, and you know,
My students too.
okay, very good, Adam.
So I actually have two questions. First of all, how would one go about making such a grassroots movement in the middle of a war?
What you don't, it's after the war. Nothing happens during the war. You look, again, let's call it 50, because there's 47 that we know of, but there's other forms of these truth and reconciliation committees.
Yeah.
A relatively small number of them, the best known probably Guatemala, actually incorporated the truth and reconciliation format in the peace treaty. So as part of the peace settlement, the government and the rebels agreed to establish this commissioners. So we're talking essentially, with rare exceptions that one could look at and think about the post-war process. We are outside of time now. See, you understand, political time. So, but if one goes back to the situation before February and say, well, that's more or less normal, except that there was still a lot of division in society that was unaddressed and resolved. One of the things I did in my book was to look at all the variants of the Minsk Accords, all the what I call the external peace formulas, and then all the internal peace formulas that exist as well, some of them better known than others. The fault of the external ones, just to summarize, is that the Ukrainians are just being told what to do, and they don't have to buy in at all. It's just someone telling them what to do this, and you'll be fine. We'll throw money at the problem, and then you'll be happy, because you can be consumers. The internal ones focus on the cultural differences, and to different degrees, they talk about exactly what I'm talking about, the need for reconciliation and how to do that. And if you look at Sergei Sivolkov's experience in this, he was tasked by the president to set up a number of these kind of initiatives, and he was kicked out of the National Security and Defense Council, but he continued his efforts. It all involves largely grassroots efforts, which again mimic a lot of examples that have been out there. And he has had as his advisors, specifically people from Yugoslavia and Northern Ireland. So those are the two models that he's looking at. Maybe there are larger ones that he could include as well. But again, none of this is new. None of this is terribly original. It's just people shifting focus. And one of the big problems in having anything, any sort of discussion in the society is the formulation of the conflict by the Ukrainian government and the West. But I'm not going to say, who's driving whom. But nevertheless, the Ukrainian government says there is no problem. There's no internal problem. Period. It's all external invasion. Russia's intervention. And that is just looking at Ukrainian history beyond the last few years, even if you could argue that Russia's been the primary instigator in the divisions in Russian society, even if we could argue before, like since 2014. Then before that, you still have what used to be a scholarly consensus on what Samuel Huntington called the cleft society. So we still have that to deal with. And that problem isn't going away.
You refer to the
Questions over here, Mike.
I'm
We'll get to you, Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, so, well, thank you very much, Dr. Petro.
Petro.
So I am eager to read your book.
Wow.
Christmas, so it was a very good promotion for it. I'm gonna ask a question about its audience. For whom did you write the book? For whom is this presentation? And I'm especially intrigued because you mentioned Bologna
Issue.
my Ukrainian speak.
Hmm.
Put a Polish accent on this. But I'm wondering, when you're talking about integral nationalism, and when you're talking about this being, maybe you would say hegemonic, but maybe the dominant view after my death. Who are the integral nationalists now? And let me just mention another sociologist, Nicolai. Do you know his work?
I've heard the name, but
Yeah, so he's been one of the most prominent, I think, interpreters. In fact, he interpreted Maidan as a revolution of dignity, which might help give you a clue from where he continues, if I remember correctly. So I can't ask about him since you don't know his work, but so first, who are these integral nationalists with specific names that sort of illustrate the problem of nationalism? Secondly, how would your argument come American Western points of view versus Russian Belarus points of view? Would you say that it is more complementary to the visions that you see in Belarus? And three, therefore, if that is the case, how in a war can you communicate to those who are seen as the victims of external aggression? So it's a little bit like this point. You have to be after the war in order to initiate it, but you're presenting it in the midst of the war, which will perhaps color its reception.
be that as it may, there's nothing I can do about that. Well, because I've been working on this book for a long time. I mean, a long time. This is a perspective that I've come to after 10 years of thinking about it. There were a lot of approaches that didn't make sense to me. And then, as I described, I hit upon Richard Liebau's book, and we've been in correspondence. And I understand his perspective is a well-established one in IR theory. And I said, that's great, but I want to apply, I think it has an application domestically as well. It's not only to relations between countries, but within countries. And really the Greek example straddles both worlds, I think. So who's my audience? My audience are Ukrainians. I really am not speaking to Russians, and I have really not a lot of audience in the West. Everybody's run to their respective intellectual ghettos. So, I mean, my argument is out there, and people can do what they want with it, but I am addressed, and I've always been concerned, first and foremost, with the situation in Ukraine. And I spent a long time there, and I spent about half of my sabbatical last year in Odessa. It is, you could argue it is, and this would be a legitimate point, that it is colored by Odessa. Odessa is, well, it's not Lvov, and it's not Donetsk, and it's not Kiev, or even Kharkov. But you know, I feel that I see the people that I'm talking about, and in Odessa, so they are specifically those Malaros, who, by the way, and I can't stress this enough because it's not often heard, they are Ukrainians. They are loyal Ukrainians from everyone's perspective, except the state. Except the state. Now, who am I talking about when I'm talking about integral nationalism? If you recall the period immediately after the Maidan, the role of the far right, which is an amalgam of groups there are names that we've heard of, like Yarosh Bieletsky, others, Komengol, Masichuk. Those are names that were important in the heat of those events. But the strategy of the far right is not only a military strategy. It is a strategy that extends into the present from its main ideologists. And I'm thinking of Dmitry Dontsov and of course Siborsky. So their works, which are publicly cited as part of the creed of the understanding of what needs to be done for Ukrainian society in order to transform it, in order to make it all that it can possibly be, a true Ukrainian society, is adopted without criticism, without innovation, without, it's basically just there for the young Ukrainian nationalists to derive inspiration from. And then it works its way through various organizations, which in modern, so since the military wing, let's say the civic wing of the far right has split off from the military wing, it has become much more a matter of things like summer camps, ideological training, sometimes paramilitary, sometimes not, which young people can get involved in so that they become inspired by, you've all probably seen the emblems, it's, Azov again is not just a battalion, it is a civic movement. It has so many more connections in society now, since it has really shifted away from being a more isolated military formation into a social and civic military formation. And their emblem, as you recall, is the Volksangel, but it's been recast as idea of the nation. Okay? And you see that symbol a lot. They're influenced, the areas that I mentioned, specifically the heads of the ministries appointed after the 2014 Maidan were from Svoboda, so the Svoboda party at the time, and which would be part of the general universe of the far right. And they have, by and large, kept control of the direction of policy in the areas that are of most interest to them, which are security forces and cultural policy. So Vladimir Ющенко, I don't know whether, because you mentioned Vinitsky, Ющенko is, well, to my mind, one of the foremost sociologists in Kiev, but he has in recent years moved to Germany. So he's at the Freie Universität in Berlin now. But he is, to my mind, you can see a lot of his interviews and things like that, the foremost sociologist of the origins and history of the far right, specifically. Maybe I can't speak.
About 10 years ago.
I can't speak to whether he's that well known for his analysis of society in general, but he really kind of made his name by tracking the influence of the far right groups like throughout the country and how they multiplied, things like that.
Richard?
Thank you very much. It's very interesting. I'm a former diplomat, so let me not be diplomatic. It kind of seems to me like you missed your moment. That the war changes all this in, I think, two ways. One is I'm not aware of any of the truth reconciliation processes that were done in the presence of foreign forces. And they were internal domestic things, and therefore to set up this scenario again, you'd have to have Russian overthrow And then second of all, if this is going to end, as many of us fear, with an annexation of the Donbass into Russia, won't people just vote with their feet, decide if they want to be Russian Ukrainians or Ukrainian Russians?
Yeah. What I've written is an afterword to these events. There's no way that I can meaningfully, or I think anybody really can meaningfully comment on the situation on Ukrainian society today until the military aspect of the conflict is resolved. It'll be resolved someday, one way or another. And once the situation on the ground is clear to all sides in that conflict, then there will be negotiations. And out of that negotiation will come some peace settlement, which will then have to be sold to everybody, because nobody will be happy with it entirely. And part of that sales pitch should be this. That's what should happen, because it's happened before. It happened in Colombia, it happened in Guatemala, it happened probably 24 places. I don't know all the examples. Timor-Leste is an interesting example because of the direct involvement of Indonesia, which left and reinvaded, then left again. And then there was a reconciliation that involved the should I call them Timor-Lestes? East Timorese. And then there was a presidential commission that was set up to reconcile the two countries. Now, saying that you're going to reconcile are just words on paper. Of course, it's going to take a lot of time. But whenever people, I think we're somehow ahistorical when we say, well, now things are forever different. Things always look the same to me when you take a bit of historical perspective. My God, when I thought about this, I started to think, what do we have in our history that sounds awfully familiar? Oh, the Mexican-American War, 1848, when we stole half the country. Now, General Grant, not general at the time, but later General Grant, called the Civil War God's punishment on us for the atrocities that we committed in the Mexican-American War, after which we invaded that country 10 other times. Now, how are our relations with the Mexicans today? Probably it all depends on who you're talking to, things like that. But there are Americans who go there and can live there and retire there, and there are Mexicans who come here, and everything, you know, time really does, as the monument in Poltava says, heal all wounds. Maybe not in my lifetime. I would doubt that, frankly. But I would not assume to presume what two nations that have shared inevitably so much and that are not going anywhere. They're still going to be right next to each other. And there's still going to be girls and boys who meet on a train and figure out that it's more or less speak the same language and fall in love or whatever. And then what? Then you have another mixed marriage again. And what do you do with that? All of these things will keep happening. Let's think about that as well.
Glad to share that pulled out of my bag earlier. Tony.
Yeah, I'm kind of struck that the whole thing is built on a model that what we're looking at is a civil war. And it kind of strikes me as kind of obscene to think that this is a civil war when most of the combatants in the Donbass are on both sides speaking Russian. And you have, you know, a city like Kharkiv. If this was a civil war, why didn't the population just decide to join Russia? So on what basis do you say the invasion reignited the civil war? on what basis do you think that the biggest grass movement in Ukraine now is that the Russian speakers are declaring with their lives their loyalty to the Ukrainian state?
I didn't catch the last part.
I mean, it seems like the biggest grass movement now is Russian-speaking Ukrainians laying down their lives for the Ukrainian state. They are not, if there was a civil war, you might imagine them fleeing, or instead they're being deported. Or is that just propaganda that they're being deported?
So what I said was that there are three conflicts here. And the one that strikes me as the one that has been underway the longest is a civil conflict between.
You use the word
East
reignite a
and-
civil war.
in Donbass. Yes, I did say that, in Donbass. And that seems to me to be hard to deny that for 8 years, there has
So you
been a
look
rebellion
at the
in Donbass.
you see the Donbass conflict in 2014 as a civil war?
Well, at the time, it was portrayed that way, it was seen that way.
No, do you think it was a civil war?
It was.
As opposed
it
to
was so if you look at the history.
I don't
of
want to know. I
Donbass,
want to know what you think of the 2014 incursion, invasion, provocation in the Donbass. Was this a civil war or something else?
So the history of Donbass is one in which one can trace a number of examples of public opposition to Ukrainianization of that territory. And in 2014, those regions and Crimea responded to
They
the
responded,
Maidan.
as opposed to Putin
responded.
responding.
Donbass and Crimea. So Donbass and Crimea responded to the Maidan by rejecting a government change that they felt was illegitimate. At that time, in the first months between February and August, when the anti-terrorist operation was launched by Petro, there was a lot of negotiations, and there were a lot of missions going back and forth from Kiev to, well, Crimea before the referendum and later to Donbass. Unfortunately, the sides couldn't come to an agreement, although the people that were involved in that process feel that they were very close. But then the decision was made, for whatever reason, and I think under the psychological influence of the loss of Crimea, to use military force in the Donbass to quell that rebellion.
So what you just said to me is that there was an internal negotiation that looked like it might have come to fruition, which was not a civil war. It's the opposite of a civil war. That was then turned into a civil war by an external incursion. Somebody who decided to use military force.
Kiev.
So you think that
Petro Poroshenko launched a military incursion which is called the anti-terrorist operation at the end of August. The week before, the delegates from the Rhode had reached a tentative agreement on the nature of that, on allowing the rebels who had seized control in regions of Donbass to lay down their arms. But then things went another way for reasons that we don't quite understand. But if you read the accounts of Nestor Shufrich, who was part of that delegation, he will go on, and he's been on Ukrainian television a number of times explaining how close they were to never having had a civil war at all. The decision to quell that rebellion by force indeed resulted in a great deal of the subsequent harm that we've seen in Ukrainian society.
Yeah, thank you. So Michael asked earlier, who is your audience? And I think the answer is, I don't know that you intend that to be the audience, but the audience that would most agree with you would be in Russia. Our former diplomat asked or suggested that the book is too late in the sense of what has happened now. And I think Tony was saying what has happened now is that large numbers of Ukrainians seem to want to fight for Ukraine for whatever reason we may.
Well, that's very understandable to me.
Yes, it is understandable, but it's still.
But that doesn't mean they're not going to change who they are.
No.
Culturally,
But they're willing to die for.
They just want that to be part of their identity and be recognized fully as loyal Ukrainians, and this helps that actually.
So
their defense of their country helps that.
So let me ask the following. And I wonder first, I have a couple of questions. So I wonder first, how does your interpretation of this civil strife in Ukraine, which you imply ultimately resulted in Russia's attack on Ukraine in a criminal war against Ukraine, though I can't, this is the implication of what you're saying. Although you don't want to talk about the war, but you're sort of implying that the criminal invasion of the country, destruction of entire cities, dislocation of 10 million people is a response to civil strife or some kind of civil strife in Ukraine before that. How does that play into the fact? Let me finish. How does that play into the fact that recently there was an election in which a president was elected in a landslide, much more than any American president has received in a long time, and he happens to be an ethnic Jew? How does that play into this interpretation? That's my first question. The second is what you present is what would happen after the war. Once the war is over, we don't know how it will end, but at some point there will have to be truth and reconciliation within Ukraine. Now, if we actually look at the situation now and what is happening in Ukraine right now, and who is causing what is happening in Ukraine, it would seem to me that before there's a truth and reconciliation, once this war hopefully is over, there would have to be a criminal tribunal, an international tribunal against the people who are perpetrating this criminal war. And I suspect that that tribunal, if it happens, would have long-term ramifications for whatever kind of reconciliation there would have to be in Ukraine, because these are public affairs in which everyone gets involved. So it seems to me that the idea of the TRC after the war is extremely far-fetched and extremely unlikely. So
exactly.
Yeah.
Well, so your point, criminal tribunals, very common in the TRC process. The solutions vary, but if you look at the standard approach, it involves amnesty. which of course is not new in the context of the kind of negotiations that we had over, with respect to the Maidan itself and to the Minsk process.
Amnesty for Putin?
Amnesty for all, blanket amnesty, blanket amnesty. So this, I'm just pointing this out, this is a standard aspect of Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, which have involved not only civil strife, but internationalized civil strife. In other words, the intervention, the intervention of foreign participants in civil conflict.
But if you're talking about international tribunals that I can think of, say Nuremberg, and after the war in the former Yugoslavia, and after Rwanda, that's not the result of it. People are identified as criminals.
Yes, but most of the commissions, or a number of them, I hesitate because I haven't looked at each example, but a number of them reach an accord among the political participants over issues of criminal accountability. And then against the wishes and advice of the United Nations, which often serves as a consultant in these matters, they then set aside the recommendations of the UN and say, and narrow the focus to a handful of people, most of whom are never convicted. And they either die in prison or I should say, not even go to trial, things like that in Chile, in Argentina, other examples. So again, I am not the person to judge what's right or what's wrong. I'm not a moral philosopher. But if you look at what has actually happened in the application of the process, we see that they split the decision to some extent down the middle between justice as an ideal and what can we accomplish that will move society forward. And sometimes they make choices that make a lot of people uncomfortable. In Spain, for example, I'm partial to the Spanish example because they had a 30-year pact of forgetting. But what happened is that people didn't forget exactly, but a generation arose that said, okay, well, now our grandfathers are dead, things like that. Now I'd like to re-examine this and let's have a new Truth and Reconciliation Commission now that didn't address the issues of a generation past. And well, we'll see where that goes. Again, not everybody's happy with this, but it is a form of resolution. What I said is I called Russia's intervention a selfish and narrow-minded pursuit of her own national interests.
Well, it's much worse than that.
You can be of that judgment.
Let's, I think
I'm not going to tell you how to think.
Close here, but I'd like you to all please join me in thanking Nicolai, Petro for the argument here. That's exactly what was intended, and that's working hard, thinking hard about a very difficult and deep emotional subject. So thanks so much, and also to our friends.
I don't know when our students want to go back, but I'm happy to hang around and chat with anyone.
Yes, we just scratched the surface. I just want to say, as you're walking out, I want to remind you that next week, David Disseau, who was just back from 5 years in the Russian heartland, will share not only insights about Russian governance and how Russia has thought about all this, but also talk in particular about the energy issue, which is forefront in our minds. We have such great expertise in that. And the week after that, Chaz Freeman will sit in the hot seat and pull forward on
Talk about provocative.
on where the difference is. Right. We aim to provoke. All right, thanks everyone for coming.